I'm Stephanie Duncan Karp. I'm a managing director at Potrero Group. In that role, I am our chief product officer. I kind of oversee our services and their delivery, and I'm also our chief storyteller. And I will tell you a little bit more about how that came to be really soon. Potrero Group's a leadership consulting firm. We work with nonprofits and folks in the social impact space. We provide facilitation, strategic planning, board development, organizational development. We also recruit board members and we do executive search. We're really well known by environmental organizations, but we also serve clean energy and sustainable food and increasingly public media organizations and public gardens and museums and zoos and really folks all over the nonprofit sector. And I'm assuming you're here because you're also in that sector and you've heard some of these things, that storytelling brings your mission to life and that you should be telling really specific human stories that are emotionally compelling and, kind of all of this best, wisdom and best practices around, change-making communications. And you're wondering how, because I don't think it's intuitive how to build emotional connection through story. What does that look like, right? So, I see a lot of organizations, whether it's telling a story about a specific client or success story or case, or kind of telling the story of their organization, kind of going in a linear fashion, delivering a lot of information. But sometimes, it can feel like just a big pile of information or an anecdote or a timeline. What distinguishes a story from an anecdote, a timeline, organizational background into story? How do you do that? It's through narrative structure. And what I'm going to do today is talk about what narrative structure is, what are the elements of narrative structure, how do they function in literature and art, like how do they actually function in storycraft, and then how does that translate to the work that you do? So everyone's probably familiar with this. I think this is the first thing we learn about story and story structure, that stories kind of begin with this a tour of the world, so to speak. This is kind of the context that we're in. This is the protagonist day to day. And then there's an inciting incident, and that leads to some consequences and some actions, and that those build and build and build toward an ultimate conflict, a climax, where that protagonist has to make a choice or take some meaningful action that then has some fallout. There's some sort of rolling consequences from there, and then things return to a kind of resolution, a kind of stasis. And it's not the same as it was before, but we're sort of out of motion and we're at a place of rest. That is not story structure. This linear shape, it's a plot shape. It's a very common plot shape in Western art. It's not the only plot shape, but it can't hold up a story. A story is a three-dimensional thing that needs real deep structure. So I'm going to demonstrate what that means through a little autobiographical story. So I'm going to first use the first story structure we looked at to tell you a little bit about me. So here's some exposition. This is where my story starts. I grew up on the Oregon coast. One of my first jobs was supporting an executive director at a land trust when I was 17. That was my first kind of step into nonprofit work. And an inciting incident for me was that I chose to go to college on the East Coast. And I had a real explosion in my understanding of culture and my exposure to culture and ideas. And it led me in a totally different path. I majored in performing arts. I was writing plays, really living the, really blossoming as an artist and developing a creative life. My first job out of college was supporting an artistic director at an off-Broadway theater company. This is a production of Antigone that I supported. I was really supercharged here and thought this was what I was going to do with my life. But as you might know, being an artist isn't super lucrative. And living in New York and Philadelphia, I didn't have a lot of support structures there. And so that brought me to choose to go back to the West Coast. I decided to go to the Bay Area where I had some family that had moved. There's a lot of economic opportunity there. And my experience in land trusts and my experience doing productions led me to a think tank that was holding convenings, creating conferences, bringing in thought leaders that were connecting the environmental movement and public land specifically to larger societal issues like public health, like sustainable food, and trying to make those connections. It was a really wonderful place. I got exposed to cross-sector collaboration. I learned so much about the environmental movement. It's both its history and where it was going. It was really compelling work. It really sucked me in. At the same time, I kept making my silly little art. And I, I had a solo performance that was commissioned in Philly. I was kind of going back and forth between these things for a long time. But the work over here started to really kind of consume me. And I really stayed in that nonprofit vein. My story really came to a climax when I realized, gosh, I've kind of let this person go. And short of being able to put on productions, having the space and the resources to do that, I started to dabble in fiction as a way to maybe get back into that again. And I wanted to test myself. Could I really make a living doing this? Could I really lean into it? The way I tested myself was I applied to MFA programs and I got into the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is incredible. I felt like I had no business being there. But when I got there, I realized everybody else felt that way too. and it was a really wonderful, really lucky experience. And I started publishing stories. And I also kept doing the work because it's wonderful and it really has meaning and impact for me. And so the place that my story kind of comes to a rest is that I've learned to balance these things. They're both really alive for me, and I kind of keep them separate, but keep doing both. So that's fine. I think if you know me, like if we've worked together, as some of us have, that's kind of interesting stuff to know about me. If you don't know me, I'm not sure that I've given you the tools to really connect and really invest in that story and make meaning out of it. Let me add just one narrative element, one element of narrative structure that kind of starts to give some shape to that story. So hi, I'm Stephanie Karp. I'm a managing director at Potrero Group. I have two really interesting sides of my career and backgrounds. On the one hand, I've spent my entire career in the environmental and social change space, doing work with nonprofits, governments. And on the other hand, I have this really developed artistic life, and I'm a writer, and I create art. Those things don't really touch each other. I actually keep them very separate. I like it that way. I have a very different persona in each. My worlds don't really collide, but they're both active in me. And there's a way in which when I ring one, the other rings louder, brighter, more clearly. And by moving back and forth between the two, I become louder, brighter, I bring more clarity, I'm more effective at the other. I've introduced here this metaphor of the tuning fork. And it allows me to kind of bring up this theme, this big question about what it means to be human, I guess, which is, can you lead a double life? Is it okay? Does it serve you? Does it harm you? What is at stake when you do that? And if I were to continue to revise my autobiographical story, let's say like into a memoir or a one-act play or solo performance or something, I would probably start to arrange the details of my background around that theme. So I would dramatize times that those two things have been in conflict. When maybe it kind of got me in trying to do them both got me into trouble. I would probably also dramatize times where having the one in my back pocket really served me, or maybe even saved my neck. And ultimately, through the telling of that story, dramatizing all the sides of that theme, I'd probably be driving toward the conclusion that, yes, it is good to develop different sides of yourself. It's okay if you don't decide to make one more central than the other. It can really serve you. That is what would shape my story. I think that as we have kind of seen this rise in storytelling in nonprofits and in change work and all this encouragement to humanize, tell, human stories, get into the specifics of what you do and demonstrate the impact and things, we sometimes forget that abstraction is okay. And in fact, we need some level of abstraction. We need some level of theme values at play. We need to understand what values and themes are at play in the story to make meaning out of it, because we are meaning-making machines, and that is why we prefer stories to other forms of information. So this sad triangle can't help us. This structure, making sure all the pieces of your story are in place, will allow you to hold up the complex three-dimensional thing that is your story, your organization's story. I want to keep my writer artist hat on and unpack some of this in action through an actual story. Let's look at one that is, in my opinion, one of the great stories in American storytelling, but also one of the most boring. Hardly anything happens. It's about like a white wealthy dude in New York City in the 60s. We shouldn't really care about him. He's not a good guy. But we loved this story so much when it came out. The story is Mad Men. So let me show you how some of these elements work in this story. So on the one side, you have kind of what happens. Each week, episodically, Don Draper does stuff, and the stuff that he does reveals his character to us. It shows us who he is and kind of his value system as he moves through the world. So the things he does and says show us that he doesn't believe in rules or really have a kind of a strong moral compass. Like he doesn't think there's sort of inherently good things to do or bad things to do. There's just context. He lives a double, triple life, and he's a different person in different contexts. He makes impulsive decisions sometimes. He goes kind of after what he wants, and he will tell lies to kind of keep things going just to serve himself. He does tell people what they want to hear. And at the same time, these things that are really kind of working against him as a character, they serve him very well in his job. So we see him be super competent in marketing for these same reasons. The show spends it invests a lot in the world, 1960s Midtown Manhattan and the sleepy suburb where his family lives. There is so much detail and nuance here. It is fully populated with people from elevator operators to business owners down the street, clients, folks throughout the organization. It is a rich world. They actually only used organic produce in production because they didn't have any of the sort of like large shiny apples that we have now in the 60s. Like it's that level of world building that they were committed to. There are characters populate every story, but more importantly, we really understand the relationships between those characters. And it's not just between Don and everybody else, but there are really interesting relationships between other characters like Peggy and Pete and Roger and Joan that we get invested in as well. They're really rich, and we understand also what those people want, what they're trying to get all of the time. If we didn't understand what was moving these characters through their world, motivating their interactions with each other, we would totally check out. Some of the things that Don wants are to protect his secrets because it allows him to kind of live the life he wants to lead, avoid pain. Some of the reasons he's keeping those secrets in the first place, and win clients. Like there is to kind of this like material thing driving a lot of the episodes too. And there's stuff at stake if he doesn't get those things. His marriage is at stake. His reputation and identity are at stake. The survival of his company is at stake. Various relationships get kind of put at stake given what is happening. And then this is critical to why the show is important to us. There are themes being dramatized at all times, starting from the pilot. In the pilot, Don tells us, let me see, I want to say it exactly how he says it. Happiness is freedom from fear. It's a billboard on the side of the road that screams with reassurance that whatever you're doing is okay, that you're okay. We learn right away in the story that this is a person who doesn't think happiness is a real thing. And the show explores, well, is it, is it worth pursuing? We see a lot of different characters grappling with this theme and what it means. Like, what does that mean to be in a world where that's the case? Is that sustainable? Is it good? And kind of similarly, if there are no rules, how should you behave? This is both a value system that Don holds personally, that he's sort of believes in moral relativism, right? But he's also living in a context where this is at play. After World War II, a lot of social structures are breaking down in the 60s. A lot of stuff is up in the air. And if it's really unclear what those value systems are, if they're changing, how do you live your life? What does it mean? How does this play out? And this is dramatized over and over and over again, and it's how we make meaning of the show. The story ends because Don kind of comes to a place where he can't live with those values anymore. Like he's kind of realized his life is pretty meaningless without values. And we see him in the final episode. He's at Esalen, of all places, on the California coast at a meditation retreat, kind of grappling with hitting up against the fact that this value system isn't serving him, and he actually has to kind of start all over again. And that's when the story ends. We've like kind of been driving through these themes as an argument towards some meaning. And we've needed that the whole time, not just the details, like not just the world and the rich world and the characters and what they want. Like we needed that too. And the themes also helped give it structure because it helped the writers decide what to dramatize and what to leave out. Vivian Gornick is a memoirist. She's written this book, The Situation, the Story. It's kind of foundational in how writers approach creative nonfiction, personal essay, and things like that. So this is a quote from the introduction to that book. Every literature has both a situation and a story. The situation is the context or the circumstances. Sometimes it's the plot. The story is the emotional experience that preoccupies the writer, the insight, the wisdom, the one thing the writers come to say. That thing is often abstract. And I'm not saying that these two things live separately, that there's sort of this side of the story and the other side of the story. The story is the interplay between those things. How do values hit the real world? You know, how do they play out in the real context in which we live in, where we find ourselves? That's what brings a story to life. Okay, so let's unpack these a little bit more and start to translate what each of these narrative elements means for you as a leader, means for your organization. How does it play out? What am I talking about? And I also want to use what I know from how these things play out in Storycraft to challenge some of your assumptions about what you should and shouldn't be sharing with your audience, and how these things actually kind of play out in story. So the world, what is your context? Everyone knows, I think this one isn't very confusing, but you know, kind of what is the world in which you operate? Is it national? Is it a local community? Is it a field of practice? And who are kind of the actors that populate that world? Who else is in your space, so to speak, and how do you sit in that space? A lot of the stuff, like a lot of the world building stuff, you can do really successfully with imagery. You know, I'm sure you already do on your website and things. So you can kind of like use less word count on that stuff so that you can focus on these other aspects of world building on the right side, which are more, what are you up against? What are the antagonistic forces that are complicating your world and the work that you're trying to do? And are there any tailwinds? Are there any kind of emerging opportunities, timely opportunities that we're facing right now in the present tense that inform kind of how you sit in your world and what's shaping not just your organization, but the world in which you operate? Doing some of this world building helps us understand what kind of story this is, right? So are we in a story about world powers embroiled? Are we in a story about a specific community that really cares about something that is about to be lost or at stake? Having a sense of the size, scope, scale, the world of a story helps us sit so that we can pay attention. Until we kind of have a sense of this, we're trying to figure it out. So if you don't lay this groundwork, your audience is distracted and asking questions about that while you're trying to tell them other things. Relationships, not just characters, relationships. Who are you to your constituents? Who is your organization to your constituents, your partners, your funders, your clients, your community members? Are you an advocate? Are you a behind the scenes operator kind of whispering in the powers that be? Are you a partner in crime? This stuff it not only should inform the tone of your communications to different audiences, or maybe to, to all your audiences, it's also just juicy. Like we want to know. This is the stuff that also humanizes your organization. Like who are you? What is the quality of those relationships? And I think it's good to know as the person holding the story. Which of your relationships are kind of fraught? Are there villains? Do you have allies? Like, how does this play out in your work? And I'm not saying you should go out there and air all your bad relationships or dirty laundry or get really gossipy or something. I'm just saying that it's good to have an understanding of this stuff. And I think it's actually good for the rest of the people you work with, your team, to have an understanding of this stuff, uh, at least so that you can deploy it thoughtfully. Want and goals. How committed are you? Every nonprofit I know has a vision statement, right? Some like big compelling vision that your mission drives toward, that is unlikely to be achieved in your lifetime, but is, a world in which you want to live, a world that you care about and are having a hand in creating. Um, this is really important, obviously, but if we go back to story and how story works, I want to remind folks that it's not just knowing what a protagonist wants, but seeing their demonstrated commitment to getting there. How badly do they want it? And we see that play out in story as characters getting really creative in how they achieve their goal, in achieving that goal even when the odds are against them. These are some of the elements that you can bring into not just your vision statement on your website, but into the way you tell your story. Like, what are some of the ways in which you've persevered or been creative? Demonstrate that like sense of desire, because that is what hooks us through the stories you keep telling it. If we talk about the context as like, I know the context, I can sit down and listen. This desire to get there is what pulls us through. Interestingly, if you look at Storycraft, we actually don't have to believe that the goal is achievable. I'm not saying that you should give the impression that your organization is incapable. But what I mean is that sort of the bigger and badder the goal, it's great as long as we really believe that you are fully committed to getting there. I think about the movie uh, Little Miss Sunshine, about this little girl who, like, we know enough about beauty pageants to know that this little girl does not fit the type. She is unlikely to win this beauty pageant that she is driving across the country to get to. But her desire to get there is what pulls us through the movie and causes all the actors around her to rise to the occasion and support her. I mean, it is the driver of the movie, and we have no expectation, like very little expectation. There's a moment right at the end where they kind of make us want to believe, but really we don't believe, that she's going to get there. That's not what's keeping us engaged. So think about that as you talk about your vision and demonstrating just that like deep, deep want. I also want to say, when you're telling stories about clients, for example, like individuals that you've served or success stories, there's also a way in which like not believing the goal is achievable, but still being really hooked into their desire to get what they need can invoke a sense of injustice in us, right? Like if we really believe that that is how it should be, that is what that person should be able to get. They should be able to get asylum. They should be able to get whatever, whatever it is. That emotion is really powerful actually, and doesn't really have much to do with achievability. It has a little bit more to do with just our belief in how the world should be, and invoking that isn't terrible. Stakes. So you want this thing really badly, and what if you fail? Everyone in your organization needs to be able to speak to this, not just you, and it should be alive in all of your communications, in a way. So I think a good way to get at this is, thinking about what you provide, what you protect, what will happen if that thing is lost or missed. And then what would happen? Like, try to take yourself one further step. Like, what does that mean for our society? What does that mean for the community at large? What does that mean for the values that you hold? And then, so what is that real loss? Tangibly, like kind of less abstractly, I think there's also sometimes things at stake that might be less visible to people outside of your organization, or if you're talking to a larger audience, to people outside your field. And so it's also, I think, it's good to allow some word count, allow some space to educate people on what those potential consequences are that are a little bit harder to see. And the more that you unpack this in your organization, you'll understand, you'll be able to deploy that stuff a little bit better. This also ties back to, this is where there's a relationship between all these narrative elements, right? So you want to tie this back to, what are you up against, and what are your tailwinds and themes. Themes, we need them to understand what the story is about, like what gives it meaning. And they're usually rooted in your values. I think it's great, this movement toward having a list of values, like having a value statement, at hand. But I want to encourage you to dramatize those in your stories, elaborate on them, test them, push against them. I also want to point out that themes aren't always necessarily your values. One of the things you might be up against is inertia. That is a theme that you might dramatize. Your value is innovation, right? Or your value is collaboration or something. But there can be a theme of inertia at work. And what does that do to the issue you're working on? Like, how does that play out in your world? So do this exercise with yourself. Like, put your values into play. Put them into some context. Where do they meet your world? How does inertia play out in your world? How does collaboration play out in your world? How does it play out in your relationships, and color them and change them, or inform? How does it inform how you go about your work? Um, and how does that theme address what's at stake? How does it frame what's at stake? I was looking around for examples, and I went to IDEO, which is a firm I really admire. And beyond sort of like just making the kind of story we're in abundantly clear through this header and the subheader, this making voting easier. The country's largest jurisdiction creates a more accessible voting experience. This is about their work with LA County to redo their entire voting system, kind of soup to nuts. The first line of the narrative: the right to vote is fundamental to American democracy. But when the process isn't designed to accommodate everyone, non-English speakers, the hearing or vision impaired, people who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices, and those who simply aren't tech savvy may find themselves disenfranchised. Then they go on to talk about Los Angeles County. There's 5 million voters here. Like, this is sort of the nuts and bolts of it. They start with an abstraction, right? Like, they start with a value tied to a stake. Like, what is at stake is our rights, and how do we protect them? And what does it mean to protect rights in a pluralistic society? Is, a system that works for most okay? It's big stuff, and it's not bad storytelling. Like, it's okay. It's good. Okay, so I'm pulling all this together in terms of how you might start to think about structuring your stories. I really encourage you to, first of all, just do a story map. Like, bring these elements out and have conversations with your teams, with your staff, with your collaborators that unpack all of these elements, so you have a sense of your palette for creating stories. And you kind of get clear about your themes. Like, often it kind of leads you to get a little bit clear about what kind of themes are at play in the work that you do. And when you go to craft a story, you get all that information out there. First drafts are messy. You probably are going to tell kind of a linear story. Go back when you're revising and think about, have I set up the context well enough for folks to make meaning out of this? Am I burying the theme? Am I introducing our values and themes too late? What do I kind of need underneath this story to make it compelling and meaningful for others? I encourage you to stay zoomed out when you're thinking about your story. Like, what is the problem at large that your world faces, who's with you, what you're going after, what's at stake? Like, all of that stuff is important to know before you go into telling specific success stories, before you go kind of highlighting personal stories. Like, this must be kind of established and understood both for you and your audience. Um, I see this a lot, which is when organizations go to introduce themselves, there's a lot of, founded in 1976, we were facing this crisis and a bunch of citizens came together and formed this, and then we went on to do X, Y, and Z. The backstory isn't as compelling to others as it is to you. It's a little bit like, I don't know that my autobiographical story that I first gave you was very compelling to you, but it's also a little bit of like when someone gives you a personal essay and you don't know them very well, and you're a little bit like, I don't really care yet. Like yeah, start in the present tense. Talk about what's at stake. Bring your values into the real world. Talk about how those are playing out. Go into backstory when it serves your unfolding present story, we understand how to do this work because we lived through X, right? Like no one needs to know your backstory in the way that you think they do to understand. They need to understand the current context, but they don't need to understand your origin story necessarily. And most successful stories don't begin at the beginning. If you think about the TV shows you love, the movies you love, the books you love, the stories you love, they drop you in to a present tense moment. Get all these things going, I guess, is what I'm driving at. And make sure that you don't bury those themes. Expand on them, keep them alive throughout the story, dramatize them in different ways if you can. Use them to organize what you tell and you don't tell, because you could tell a lot. A lot has happened in your history, in your personal history, in your organization's history. And depending on the story you're trying to tell, you need to leave a lot of it out. Let's be frank. So use themes to help you decide what's important and meaningful and what's not. And I do believe that everyone in your organization needs to be able to tell your story. And that means knowing some of the stuff that we don't necessarily train our teams on. I don't know that we think about onboarding in terms of, if you're not an executive level person, we don't typically train on like relationships to people in the space. We expect people to kind of learn that over time through osmosis. Get in there with folks. Talk about the stakes, talk about what's at stake with your team often and early. Because everyone in your organization, from board members to volunteers, can be an ambassador for your work, and they will be a better, more effective ambassador if they do understand all of these nuances. So that's narrative structure as I understand it. And I think if you go get an MFA, it's not like they're going to hand you this document and then give it to you like a blueprint that's going to make stories. But in conversations with other artists, like these things come up again over and over, and it's really hard to tell a story when these things are missing. You can kind of point to problems in a story when these different elements haven't been thoroughly set up or thought through. And it's really common in first drafts. It's just really common. You have to be a really critical and deep reader of your own work, whether it's, you're writing a speech or you're writing a blurb for your newsletter, to go back to your writing. Like writing is revision, and writing is looking for those gaps and holes, and holding yourself accountable, knowing you're not going to get away with it. Like if you have an inkling, like this doesn't feel very developed, or I don't really know what theme I'm getting at here, listen to that little, but I think it's okay. It reads fine. Like, no, you're not going to get away with it. You're not getting away with it. You're just not. And that's what I have. I want to open it up for Q&A. We'll go ahead and stop the recording soon. But before I do, our next webinar is about managing stress, especially as a leader, but everybody is a leader in your organization. And so everybody needs to know how to manage their stress within their organization and on their teams. And we have this another managing director at Potrero Group, Andrew Leiter, a certified leadership coach, and somatics really has a lot to offer here. I've learned so much from him here. So I encourage you to sign up for that webinar. We'll put the link in the chat. And stay in touch with us. Some of you might be brand new to Potrero Group, some of you are old friends, but sign up for our newsletter. There's more stuff like this once a month. Follow us on LinkedIn. We publish it there too. And if you ever want to talk shop about story, about communications, feel free to reach out to me. My email is there. And you can get in touch with Potrero Group for general inquiries as well.